Journalism is a complicated thing, and journalists are very complicated themselves. We tend to be egotistic, opinionated, very hard to work with. You can ask my boss about that. And also possibly endangered. Business models are failing, politicians and big tech are attacking the way we work. And as a result of that, the folks who end up in journalism tend to also come from a very specific space, often not reflecting the communities that they cover. We have a superb panel for you today, all folks who are trying to change this, trying to bring more diversity and more awareness into journalism in terms of what we do. With us is Bettina Chang, who works at City Bureau in Chicago, which is trying to situate journalism more within the community that it works with. We have Christina Lee from Hostwriter, which is connecting journalists from around the world and trying to reduce the bias that exists within journalism. And Vivian Schiller, who has been in journalism for decades and is currently at the head of the Civil Foundation, which is picking innovative journalism around the world. This is your panel. I think we can just start off with, because maybe not everyone in the audience is aware of your organization, so we can start off with a little bit about what each one is. Bettina, if we could start with City Bureau, what was the idea behind it? What does it do?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Bettina. I'm from City Bureau, which is based on the south side of Chicago in the US. It is a 4-year-old startup organization. I co-founded the organization with 3 people, including Daryl, who came with me here. And we call ourselves a civic journalism lab. I think part of the reason is because it makes people be like, huh? And I feel like that's usually good. It means that people are paying attention. So City Bureau is sort of a cross between a news organization and a community organization. We run 3 programs, and all of them are aimed at democratizing access to media. So in the US, we have this major issue where when it comes to class and race and media representation. I've heard that that's probably a problem in pretty much every country. But specifically around race, Chicago is probably one of the most segregated cities in the US. In fact, people say that Chicago has this dubious distinction of having invented segregation in the United States. And because of that, the neighborhoods that are mostly have residents who are black and brown tend to have worse media representation. The news stories done about them tend to be very negative, mostly crime-based. And there are very few people of color in newsrooms in the US. So what we do is we bring people into our newsroom, we train people how to do some of the basic skills of journalism, or if they wish to become journalists, we train them how to do really great community journalism. And then we also open up our newsroom all the time for these workshops where people can critique and learn how to be able to exert some influence on the media when they feel like normally they have no voice in it. Even though the media talks a lot about them, we very rarely do stories for them or with them.
Right. Tina, can you tell us a little bit about how Hostwriter came together?
Yeah, actually, our founder, Tabea Grizic, is someone who had traveled to different countries during Arab Spring and realized that working with journalists there was this like unbelievably great resource. And she, being a freelancer at the time, also thought this is actually something that everyone should have access to, because if you work for a major media organization, maybe you have a producer, maybe you have fixers, maybe you have a team working to get you hotels and to get you to people to meet. If you're a freelancer, you often don't have access to that kind of advantages. So on the one hand, it was started just with this simple idea that journalists should help each other in this way and do sort of reciprocity. So that if I come to your country, maybe you give me some advice, maybe you translate something for me, maybe you let me stay on your couch, and when you come to my country that I would do the same. I would say that the situation has evolved a lot more, though. Now we're really trying to encourage people to do much more cross-border journalism and to make the cross-border journalism that is such a big part of major stories like the Panama Papers accessible to people all over the world, so that they don't get reported about by mainstream Western media outlets, but that they get to do reporting themselves about their own countries, that they get to be the experts of the places that they're from, but that they work together with other people. So that's basically what Hostwriter is all about. It's a free network. Anyone who's a journalist can join it, and it's an opportunity to collaborate with over 4,000 journalists all over the world in 150 countries.
All right, super. And more numbers, I think, I'm sure, from Vivian as well. Tell us about the Civil Foundation.
Right. So Civil is is the purpose of Civil is to try to break down the barriers that stand between news organizations and the public that journalists go into the business to serve. So more and more, as people get their news from social media, from algorithmic feeds, there is somebody standing in between the audience and the public. So what we've done with Civil is create a network that is where there's no owner, that is completely owned and operated just by the public and the news organizations. And it, at its foundation, is something called the Civil Constitution, which stands for the journalistic ethics that Civil represents. So only news organizations that meet those journalistic standards can stay on. And it is the public that evaluates and supports those news organizations. We're built on blockchain technology, which is also one of those phrases that causes people, like you said, to go, huh? But that's what allows the sort of the self-governance to work. So we're operating all over the world. We have about close to now 60 news organizations, mostly small, from all over the world, and that will be a foundation for collaboration, which I suspect we're going to talk about.
Yeah, I know, of course, the coin is something that was discussed at length, and I'm sure, but I am actually interested to hear about how the collaboration came together. How did you pick these organizations all over the world?
Civil is open to any publisher anywhere in the world can apply. We don't pick them. I mean, I have been speaking to a lot of news organizations, and I'm encouraging them, but we don't pick and choose. And the staff of Civil doesn't judge the news organization to determine whether that news organization is worthy or not. That is in the hands of the Civil community entirely. So, we facilitate bringing the news organizations on, but then the community judges, and the community, by the way, also includes all the journalists, judges whether those news organizations meet journalistic standards. And if they don't, they can be removed through sort of a very systematic and fair process. And that has happened a number of times. The governance is actually working quite well.
Again, surprising maybe because a bunch of journalists are in there.
Yeah, exactly.
Bettina, you mentioned earlier the community guidelines to me separately, and I'd like to get into that a little bit. One of the most interesting things I found is that for City Bureau, they have a list of guidelines about how it will operate, and right in the middle of that is something that we don't discuss enough as journalists, which is the idea that a lot of our work can occasionally be extractive. We're often not writing with the people that we're writing about. We're writing to them and to others, and this is a big problem in India, partly because of a language barrier. The English language, the folks who are here, are often not engaging with folks who speak in other languages and different classes, castes, and so on. So could you tell me a little bit about that specific aspect also, not trying to do extractive journalism?
Yeah, definitely. That's actually one of the reasons that City Bureau was co-founded, because we understood that in the neighborhoods that we wanted to serve, a lot of people distrusted journalists, and they had a really good reason to do so. It's because for decades, journalists would parachute into these communities, usually on the worst day of somebody's life, ask them a ton of questions, pry really deep into a person who had died or a house that had burned down, and then just leave and never come back to tell a story there again. And no wonder, if somebody did that to you, wouldn't you feel distrustful and unhappy with that kind of coverage? So, one of the big things that we do at City Bureau is work on community engagement, which is sort of a buzzword in the US, but we thought that we really had to, as an organization that had been founded on this concept, we really needed to stake our ground in terms of what does it mean to truly engage with the people that you're working with, that you're serving. And so, yeah, one of the guidelines is about non-extractive journalism. It's about how a lot of the relationships that we make as journalists tend to be like what can you give to me, right? Like, can you give me your story? Can you give me a source? Can you connect me with this person? We're always asking for things from people, and we don't really give much back. We might say hey, you'll see your name in the paper, right? Or hey, don't you want your story told? And the answer that we kept hearing from our community was yeah, I want to hear my story told, but I want to tell it. right? Like I want to have some sort of agency in how it's told, and I don't just want somebody who I met yesterday to be like the singular voice about what my community is and what we do. And so, when it comes to non-extractive journalism, we changed the conversation to be, what can we do for you, right? We are journalists. We tend to have a lot of power. We have access to information and access to people that a lot of other people don't have, right? They can't necessarily go up to their mayor and start asking questions, but as a journalist, you can. And so, given the amount of power and access that we have as journalists, what can we do for you? And often that's like, the answer is not a story, right? Like a story that is written about a person, they're like, I already know that story, it's my story. Like, you don't have to tell it to me, but what can I do? Like if I'm feeling like I'm getting priced out of my neighborhood, like I've lived in this neighborhood my whole life, and I can't live here anymore. I don't necessarily want to see a story about me getting priced out of my neighborhood, because that's my lived experience, but what can I do about it? Like, who are the people who are actually in power and have like the ability to help me stay in my neighborhood? Or what are the institutions or the structures or the laws that are allowing for this kind of movement in my neighborhood? And that's the type of journalism that we want to do, and we do it by listening to the people that we're trying to serve.
Could you give us another, how does that work in practice? I'm sure it's still hard, right? Young journalists particularly, you guys work with a lot of young folks in high school and so on. How do you see it play out where you have to, those boundaries are pretty blurry. So could you give us another sense of like how that works?
Sure. We believe that access to information is a right? So as long as that, as a journalist, you believe in that, then it's not biased to say like, hey, this person needs this information and I'm going to give it to them, right? So for instance, we had last year been reporting on a story about a young man who had been convicted of a crime, and he was trying to appeal his conviction from inside prison, which millions of prisoners do all the time. It's a really, really difficult process, as you can probably imagine. You don't have access to a lawyer, you don't have access to the internet, and the deadlines are very strict. So we were reporting on the story of this young man, and he was telling us how hard it is to appeal his conviction. We're prepping to write this like 3,000-word, feature story, very, very emotional. He's going through this tough time in his life. And halfway through, we asked him like, hey, like we're doing this story. How do you feel about it? And he was like, well, that's fine, but like my parents aren't going to benefit from that. Like the people who I'm in prison with aren't going to benefit from that. What would really help is if somebody explained how to do this process, because it's so confusing, and all of the books that they give us are like these big legalese books, and there's no good way to keep track of your deadlines when you're sitting in prison. And so in addition to doing that feature story, we also created a zine that's it's called After the Trial, a legal toolkit for prisoners and their loved ones. And it's it's like half legal guidebook, half, just plain language way of explaining how these things work, keeping people motivated, support for your loved ones, right? Because that's like a really big part of people who are in prison. They feel like, oh my God, my family's out there, they're waiting for me. How do I keep them engaged and optimistic? So I think some people might call that advocacy journalism, but we feel like this is information that's available to pretty much everyone else in the world, right? So why wouldn't it be available to the people who need it the most, who can actually take advantage of it?
What you were saying also reminded me of this fabulous Indian film called Peepli Live, which is about journalists turning up in this little village in Maharashtra, and like everything changes because of all these journalists turning up there for a little while. You guys absolutely have to see it. You mentioned bias, and I think this is a good cue. You guys, so Hostwriter has a book coming out later this year called Unbiased, the News. How does couch surfing for journalists turn into something about bias?
Yeah, so we started out just basically pushing this idea of cross-border collaborative journalism. We want journalists to work one-to-one with each other. When you go to another country to write a story, Bettina mentioned parachute journalism, and of course that happens in neighborhoods, but it also happens in countries, right? And it's very typical to see this kind of extractive journalism on a global scale, and I think people are kind of sick of it, and we're sick of it at Hostwriter too. We don't want people who are reporters who work with other journalists to not get credit. We think that people should be able to get credit for telling stories about their own communities and not see a whole story where they did all the work and their name isn't anywhere. But what we recognized when we started talking about people collaborating across borders is that it's one thing to say, okay, get a team of people from Uganda, Hungary, and Canada and have them all work on a story. It's probably going to be a great one, interesting things. But there are still relationships between the people working on a team that reflect the same kind of prejudices and biases that we all have in our societies, right? There's colonial relations, there's racism, there's sexism, and there's all the kinds of hierarchy that we see everywhere else. And not only that, there's this other problem, which is that if it's the same kind of journalists, and I mean, in the United States, I think it's 79% white in journalism offices. In Britain, it's 93. So are we really going to get innovative news when it is the same kind of journalists from each place, the dominant group in their country, that are talking to each other across borders? Actually, we realize there's a lot of borders inside of countries that need to be broken down too. So our idea for this book was that we wanted to also work in the way that we want other people to work, which is to have an open collaboration, to encourage people of all sorts of different backgrounds to write together. And so as a result, we also offered that people could write a piece in their own language, and we would translate it. And we basically asked people to discuss what kind of barriers they face in the field of journalism, what kind of stuff made it difficult for them. So we have, for example, a transgender journalist from Mexico who talks about how often they are misgendered by their own editors or by the people that they're interviewing. We talked to someone from India talking about, or we have a piece from someone in India talking about sexual harassment in the newsroom and how the Me Too movement made her realize that that had made her leave a more substantial career to go into freelance journalism. We have science journalists who talk about how the contributions of people of color, people from different countries, are usually washed aside in favor of people from English-speaking countries or people from American context. So these are all different issues that lead to certain kinds of bias. And what we are trying to prove, I mean, we're asking questions basically, but we're trying to also demonstrate that, I think as Bettina also rightly pointed out, it's not just that trust is failing in the media because the public is stupid or something, you know? I think that often this feeling is like, why don't they trust us? We're doing such a good job, and they don't value everything. It is also partially that people don't see their realities reflected in the media that writes about them, that they don't see the stories that they're interested in being covered, and that is partially because the media is not diverse enough. And when it is the same kind of people that all sit around together, went to the same kind of journalism schools and have the same kind of background, it's only natural that they're going to have blind spots that make it difficult for them to pick up on subtleties that don't apply to them, that don't affect their life. So cross-border journalism is one way of making sure that national prejudices, national biases get changed in the way that we report about other countries. But within countries, within even newsrooms, these borders have to be broken down too. So we have basically evolved to have a more different idea of what borders mean, and recognizing the kind of borders within countries, between class, between race, between religion, between caste. Those are all things that affect the stories that we tell as well, and we want to get rid of all borders, basically.
And so we'll plug the book again, I think, at the very end, and I'll put in a plug for something I'm doing as well. But Vivian, you guys are trying to solve many things with Civil. Broken business model, how to get people more engaged. Was the idea of collaboration part of the design?
100%. It's you're right. Civil only just launched in March. We're still very new. We have huge and maybe crazy ambition to basically reinvent everything that's wrong with the internet. So, just small goals like that, starting with supporting journalism and the sustainability of journalists. But very much at the core of this is collaboration, and the idea that we're focused. At least at the foundation, we're very focused on small independent newsrooms around the world. The idea is that as we have this network, how can we create opportunities for those news organizations to collaborate together? When people join Civil, I often say, well, what is it you're most eager for? And Maria Ressa, who was in your, I'm sure everybody's familiar with, who I've been seeing in these promo tapes all the time, she said the singular, Rappler is part of Civil now, and she said the thing that she is most excited about, she said number one things that she loves most about Civil is that we have ethics at the center of everything we do, journalistic ethics. But she said the thing she's most interested in is finding ways to collaborate with all the other civil newsroom. So the idea is, if a newsroom is uncivil, it can be, it has the eyes of the community on it. It can be trusted in terms of its, journalistic core. And can you use that as a way to create a reporting network around topics that, global issues that, of course, have local resonance and local flavor. So again, we haven't, I wish I could point to a collaboration that's happened. It hasn't happened yet because it's only been a few months, but it's very much something that we're looking to do.
All right, Bettina, one aim of City Bureau is creating this pipeline of folks who are doing a different sort of journalism, and a lot of the work that has come out of it has been published all over the world, right? In various news organizations, small and large. Do you see that pipeline working? Do you find that folks, after they leave maybe and go into regular newsrooms, they have to go back or revert to a norm, or are you able to see that this idea of collaborative, community-based journalism has managed to seep in a little more into, say, Chicago or other places?
Yeah, I mean, I would love to take credit for every community-based journalism thing that's happened. No, but really, I feel like the conversation is happening in the US. I feel like every single conference I've been to in the last few years has talked about community journalism. And I think people are really grappling with what does that mean? How do I implement it? I think a lot of you guys sitting here might know that it's hard to make change in a newsroom. Newsrooms tend to be pretty set in their ways. But yeah, I mean, at this point we've trained exactly 101 fellows in our fellowship program. We're really excited about that. And they've gone on to as diverse groups as, like hyperlocal, like Block Club Chicago, which is actually a civil newsroom. Hyperlocal, we've had a fellow go to the New York Times, CNN, CBS. We just lost somebody to the Washington Post. In terms of locally, people at every level, radio, podcasts, TV, print, online. And what we've seen is that people are more willing to have a conversation about collaborative journalism and about collaborating with communities that they serve, rather than simply being like, oh, this is our audience. Like, how do we listen to our audience, right? That's like a very one-way kind of transaction. Whereas we, talking about being in the community, having events, a lot of face-to-face interaction. I just saw that one of the columnists at the New York Times is now having office hours, which is something that we started a while ago. Don't know if you got that from us. But every Wednesday I sit at a local coffee shop and anybody in the community is welcome to come to me and ask for advice on something they're writing, right? Because again, when you're talking about like what is the power that we have as journalists and how do we share it with people, one of the things that I do really well and editors do really well is we can help people edit their words, and that's a really valuable skill that we are really only using to benefit our own newsrooms. When we could help other people, I edited a 17-year-old kid's resume the other day. I talk to people about their pitches, like people who don't have any sort of institutional journalism program background. I consult with them on their pitches, and I'll be like, well, I know that this publication, will probably want you to word it this way, like this is how you can get your foot in the door. I feel that, when it comes to making a change that is as big as solving journalism's elitism problem, you can't just be like, oh, I'm going to do it, or like our organization is going to do it. You need to very much be transparent and show everybody how you're doing it and convince them that it's a good idea and ask them to, push you ahead so that we can all sort of be leaning in that way together. And I feel like, now, I think especially now, people talk about what's happening in journalism as a crisis, right? So yes, it is a crisis in its own way, but it's also an opportunity. It's an opportunity for us to sort of tear down all of these bad habits that we have as journalists and put something new in that place and actually move forward together.
Can I jump in on this point? Because I think this is such an important point, and as you very helpfully pointed out at the beginning of the panel, I've been in, I'm old, so I've been in journalism for a long time. I've seen a lot. And I feel like this is not based on hard data. This is more an observation and perhaps anecdotal. But I've noticed there's been a tipping point happened somewhere in the last, 8 years. It used to be, prior to that, in my experience, and with newsrooms, I ran NPR, I was at the New York Times, I was at CNN, that if young people came into a news organization, and the idea is people go, oh, young people are bringing in fresh ideas. But what would happen is there would be sort of Stockholm syndrome would kick in pretty quickly. And the idea was, it was almost like a young person would come into NPR or New York Times and go, oh, I'm in this like sacred, hallowed ground, therefore I need to adjust to the way things have always been here. And they became co-opted. And so you didn't have the kind of change that you would like to see from sort of fresh young blood coming in. That's changed. I feel now, somebody needs to write a PhD thesis about all the reasons for this, that now with young people, millennials, I suppose, and now younger, coming into news organizations, the reverse is happening. There's a concept known as reverse mentorship. Reverse mentorship, if you haven't heard the expression, is when, mentorship, it's usually an older, more experienced person mentoring a young person. This is the opposite. Somebody young coming in and mentoring somebody that's been there for a long time who may be older in different ways of seeing and operating and doing things. And I feel like young people, now forgive me, that sounds like such an old person thing to say, youngsters come in and they are actually changing the culture of newsrooms and demanding that things work differently. So when you talk about what's happening at City Bureau and they're going out in the world, they are changing those news organizations. And it is absolutely, as much as there's a lot of terrible things to say what's happening in the news industry, that is a thrilling, wonderful, positive change. So I just wanted to get that in there.
I just want to add really quickly, it's really not just about young people, I think that there's a lot of people who face structural barriers to becoming professional journalists. And in our case at City Bureau, we do have older folks saying like, hey, I've always thought about being a journalist, but I had to do something else in order to, make money or raise my kids or anything. And so the more that we can be inclusive of different groups who are stuck from becoming journalists, the more we'll have those voices in the newsrooms.
And I think because I'm a journalist, I'm going to take this very happy thought and be cynical about it. I'm actually curious for all three of you, but we'll start here. What happens when it doesn't work? What are the difficulties to this collaboration? Sometimes, like you said, there is bias, there's problems with how people treat each other. I'm sure there's conflict that has turned up in Hostwriter. Like, how do you deal with that? What have you seen in terms of people actually not working well with each other?
It's not that I have any examples of people not working too well together, because I guess if people don't work well together, then they probably just stop working together, and then you don't see the story, right? But the kind of hierarchy that exists already in newsrooms, of course, that can exist on a one-off collaboration between two people. But the thing is it's kind of a situation where, like, could it possibly get any worse? Like, if you have this scenario already where people in newsrooms all over the United States, but actually all over the world, were reporting atmospheres of sexual harassment, racial discrimination, age discrimination also being a huge one, especially for women, it is already very bad. So trying to work outside of that situation, trying to actually change it by having people collaborate with each other, yeah, of course, those problems are still going to show up. You might work together with someone and you think everything's going great until the same tricks that would normally apply to you, that they try to steal your story, put their byline on it, leave you off, or send you to do something dangerous, don't want to share the funds. All of these things can happen in a collaboration, of course. The whole point is just to try. We are up against a system that at the moment really doesn't work for a lot of people. And we're trying to encourage people to do something different, to work across borders, to work with people that they might disagree with. And when there is a situation like that, of course, there will be conflict between people. That's the whole point. Working with someone from another country that you're maybe in conflict with, working with someone from a group that you come from a different group that maybe looks down on those people in some way. That's what we're asking people to do, is to confront those biases, to fact check each other, to recognize the limitations of your own perception, the limitations of what it has worked already before. So there will be inevitably issues with those collaborations, but I think generally speaking, that's still a success in a way, because confronting other people, confronting your own biases, working together with people you disagree with, even when it produces conflict, is better than sitting in an echo chamber working together with people that agree with you all the time. And in Germany, we have a very famous example of this, which is the Klaas Rolocius case. I guess some of you maybe have heard of it, but a very famous Spiegel online journal author who had basically just made up stories, and had written stories about the United States, about the border with Mexico, And he was in a newsroom with a lot of people that were looking a lot like him and had a lot of the same biases as he did, and they didn't pick up that these stories were just sort of magically too good to be true. That the Syrian refugee girl is listening to a pop song that actually describes exactly her situation while he's interviewing her, which is weird because he doesn't speak her language and she doesn't speak his, but okay, it all works out. So these kind of stories eventually got picked up on, but who picked up on it? It was 2 journalists with migrant background in Germany. Those were the guys that said, this doesn't smell right to me. And everyone else was actually willing to let this guy go on forever and win prizes for stories that he partially just made up. So yeah, I think that there can be problems, but we really already have this problem existing in the media field of this kind of echo chamber of people that look alike and think alike, and times they even walk alike, so we have to change it up, and conflict will be actually good in that sense because it means people are facing their biases.
I'd open that up as well. I'm sure there's been lots of resistance to changing, the way people do their work. What do you see from talking to other journalists who are steeped in the existing culture?
Cynicism. One of the things that's been interesting in starting Civil, so I'd always been with big institutions. This is my first startup. And like all startups, it's risky. It may not work. I took, I joined Civil eyes wide open going, I could be, this could be, done in 6 months. Oh, well. But you know what? I joined because we want to try something. I wanted to try something different. I look around and I see all of the issues, and this is a big, bold vision, and I'd rather try something that doesn't work than not try at all. And yet, the interesting thing, in the news industry, there's this funny phenomenon where journalists love to criticize other journalists and other any kind of innovation. It's this very weird circular firing squad, I feel like, in the news industry when you look at the media covering media. So sort of the most difficult part in those, I don't know if this is what you were getting at, but I'm sharing this story anyway, is the criticism has mostly come from inside, he's in the house, the call's coming from in the house. It's not come from the outside or from the public. So it's just very strange. It's sort of like, dude, because there's one dude in particular who I won't name who just keeps going after us. I was like, what? Why don't you just give us a break,
Yeah, I'm not sure media rumble exactly. Like, there's lots of criticism here also, and yeah, I guess the question also then for City Bureau is, do you hear different things then from the community when your folks go out there and do this different model? That resistance to change can be broken down by trying a new model, by connecting people, and also speaking to folks. How does the community respond?
That's a great question. I think I agree with Tina that we can't afford not to be trying something different. Is I think what we really believe is that if you can't try something different, then we're resigning ourselves to the way media is now. And I don't think any of us think that that's going to be sustainable or good in the long run. But in terms of making mistakes, we're very, very open. I think that if you're not making mistakes as a journalism organization right now, then you're really not risking anything, right? There's this famous quote by the writer Dan Savage. He says, "Dirty talk is simple. You tell people what you're going to do, you're going to tell people what you're doing, and then you're going to tell people what you did," right? And Angela Sasky at the Coral Project says that that's the exact same thing with community engagement, right? That you have to tell people what you're going to do, you tell people what you're doing, and then you tell people what you did. And when you're transparent in that kind of way, even when you make mistakes, people appreciate it because they're like, oh my God, these people tried. Hey, remember like 6 months ago when they said that they would interview all of us about what we want to see in election coverage? Well, here's what they produced, and it's okay, but it's not as good as we thought it would. And then, oh wait, look, here's like an additional article that was written about how they feel like they could have done better, right? And there's nothing to lose with transparency like that because everybody likes to see self-improvement, right? Nobody wants media organizations that serve them to just be like, laying back on the couch and being like, well, that was good enough, right? So I think that the more transparent you are with how you do and how you failed especially, the better it is for everyone in the media ecosystem so other people can fail after you too.
It also increases trust, doesn't it? I think that it's something similar that we're talking about, all three of us, that we're actually talking about collaboration, but the conversation keeps coming back to trust. in a way, like trust that your media actually has good intentions about your community, that they're covering you fairly, and that it's composed of people like you, is something that will actually increase this trust, which is this big crisis. I mean, when we talk about journalism in crisis, one of the biggest ones is that many people simply don't trust the media. And I think that collaboration, that the kind of the things that we're talking about are ways to increase trust.
They've also trusted me with the time over here, and I've gotten the cue. So let's open up this session to questions. Is there anyone out there? If you do have a question, please do stand up and tell us your name as well. Any questions here? No? Okay, I'm happy to keep asking questions, but you tell me. So okay, let's go back to that then a little bit. I'm curious about how the initial idea developed with, let's say, City Bureau, but also then, like, when that resistance to change shows up, how do you convince folks that, everyone's going to sit back and, like you said, criticize and say that this isn't going to actually work? How hard was it at the start to, like, get that going initially?
So City Bureau is a nonprofit organization, which means we have a mission that we work towards, and a board of directors that holds us accountable to that mission. I think the way that we set up the mission makes it easy for us to do that, because when we started City Bureau, it wasn't to save journalism or to make sure that there's jobs for journalists in the future. We wanted to make journalism work for the people, right? So when we talk to the people, nobody is against change in media, in local media. In fact, going back to trust and this idea that people don't necessarily trust journalists, we did a survey. We partnered with the University of Texas to do a very official phone survey about how people perceive media in Chicago, and we found that the areas where we work, which are mostly Black and Latinx neighborhoods, often low income, that they say that they don't think that local media does a good job of telling their story or quoting the right people in their neighborhoods. However, compared to the neighborhoods that are more affluent and white, they are more likely to say that they would participate in the production of news in order to help news organizations do better. And I think that that's such an important thing, is that, like, maybe they've lost trust in the way that we do things, but they haven't lost trust in a potential future where we could do things better. And so I think that, like, when we got that data point back, we knew we were on the right track, even though we were going to some conferences where journalists were looking at us really skeptically, or even some of our funders were like, how are you going to do that? There are always people, I think, who are at the top of a power structure who are going to advocate for the status quo. And if you're looking for change, then you have support from the people who aren't necessarily benefiting from the status quo.
Tina, you had the ambassadors section of Hostwriter, right? How do you spread the message? How do you get more people onto this network?
So that's one program that we have at Hostwriter, is that we have Hostwriter ambassadors, which are basically people who spread the word about cross-border journalism in their communities. And we have, I think, 40 from basically all over the world. But what's interesting is that even starting this program was something, it was kind of an experiment that we started off with, but it again pointed out so much disparity that exists between the journalists from the different countries we were talking about. We wanted to have a conference and bring everyone to Warsaw, Poland, and we were going to pay for everyone to come. But some of the journalists couldn't get visas. And these were from countries that the European Union criticizes as having bad press freedom index, but when they want to come and do press training and they want to come and work at a workshop, they're actually not allowed to come. They're getting rejected by Poland because they're from a country which, for whatever reason, they think is unsafe, and they won't tell you why, of course. It's arbitrarily sort of defined. So we recognized also, just in this scenario, that even something like that, who is allowed to get a visa, who's allowed to travel for work, is a huge impact on who is able to tell certain stories. So this became part of also our mindset, and that's what having an ambassador network and having contact with journalists from all over the world kind of allows us to do, is to recalibrate our own expectations, because of course we are also biased, right? We're a small team, and we of course come into it from, I'm originally from the United States, my colleagues are from Germany, but that is also very particular kind of media landscapes, both of them, that don't reflect the way that the rest of the world does journalism. So having the ability to work with different people from our network also exposes us to the challenges that they have and helps us come up with ideas together with them for how to make it better. So as an example of another thing that we notice is just that journalism grants are really not available everywhere equally, you know? Some places have millions of dollars. I mean, the United States has massive amount of journalism grants at the moment. So does Europe, Western Europe specifically. Not everyone has access to that. One strategy that we then come up with for that is, okay, team with people from countries that don't have access to that kind of money to do cross-border journalism pieces. And this is one of the ways that you can also spread out this money from, and you'll get better stories because of that too, right? Writing a cross-border piece with Germany and Belgium is not gonna be like nearly as textured as something you're gonna get when you go outside of that. Or working together with journalists from Ukraine or some places that have really interesting things going on but do not have access to the same amount of funds. So it helps you to write better stories. It also helps the people from those countries to access some of these funds, which is a major barrier to many journalists all over the world being able to tell super important stories.
I'm sorry, any questions? No? Yes, there's one over there, yes. Could you stand up, please, yes?
For any journalist or news organization that is looking to diversify, looking to reach out to these communities, what tips or advice would you have for going into those communities if you are not a part of them? So if you have recognized a deficiency or a gap in your organization, what tips do you have to do to reach out to those underrepresented communities, whether you're looking to provide coverage of their issues or bring them on board as participants, whether it's in your neighborhood or around the world?
Was that directed at anyone specifically?
In general.
I think it's a great question. A lot of people are wrestling with that question right now. The way that we do it, and not to say it's the only way to do it, but City Bureau tackles every neighborhood that we work with from an asset lens. So a lot of people might say that there's neighborhoods in Chicago that are news deserts. We try to reject that kind of narrative because it's looking at that neighborhood from a deficit side, whereas people in that neighborhood do get information and news all the time, just not necessarily from an institution that's a news institution, right? And so we go in, we do this asset map research where you look at like all the different things that this neighborhood has going for it. So it could be something really big, like a big nonprofit or a charity that works in the area, or it could be something really informal, like like a grandma that sits on her porch and knows everything that happens on the block, right? So who are the people that actually already give out information and connect people to each other in the area that you're trying to work or the community that you're trying to work in, and having really good, deep conversations with those people to first come in and tell them like, hey, we come in with like, this is our intention, this is what we're trying to do, and this is what we can offer you. And when you start a conversation that way, rather than walking into a room and being like, I'm a journalist, and I want to cover your neighborhood, what stories can I tell for you, right? It changes the tone of the conversation, and it makes it more of a collaboration where people feel like they're joining in and they're helping, and so this is a joint effort between all of us, and not just like this outside institution trying to do something new here. So that's number one, and number two, I would say, is just time, right? Like people value people who show up, who are there all the time, whether or not they're trying to get something from it. They want to see you at a community meeting just sitting in the back listening, not necessarily asking questions or hounding politicians afterwards. They want to see you at like their neighborhood festival, knowing that you're there, maybe handing out pamphlets or trying to recruit people. I mean, something that we do is we train and pay people to actually cover public meetings, right? So even if you're not a journalist, we will train you to do a task, and then we will pay you to do that task because we think it's a valuable thing to do. And that's one of the ways that we get people into the door. So just a few things.
All right, I've got the timeout card, but if there's something you want to jump,
No, that's okay, we're out of time.
All right, so I will just remind everyone, this is about collaboration, so do go check out all of these organizations and give them your money, or give it to News Laundry or
We're
Scroll
free,
if
free
you
to
have
join,
them.
so you don't have to give us any money.
Civil Foundation, City Bureau, Hostwriter, go look it up, and look up News Laundry and Scroll as well, please. All right, thank you guys so much. This was a super panel, and thanks so much. Thank you.